From Studio 4 in the world headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, this is the News with Rick Sanchez.
Good evening, I'm Michelle Greenstein filling in for Rick Sanchez. This past weekend, the corporate press was reporting that the United States is fighting an Islamic State rise in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was the original justification for involvement in the country, but it seems like ISIS has taken its place. So perhaps it's a good time to examine the rise of ISIS, this Salafist caliphate that's taken over the news, although we already know who benefits from the rise of ISIS. Since 2014, ISIS has been the face of the war on terror. It's repeatedly justified no-fly zones, airstrikes, and ground troops, so it benefits those who want the destabilization of the Middle East and perpetual military involvement there. Here's former Vice President Joe Biden on how U.S. allies perhaps inadvertently supported these groups that would become ISIS.
The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens, thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad. So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria.
Also notable is the fact that ISIS never seems to attack another U.S. ally, Israel. But is the reality even more damning for the U.S.? In addition to its allies, did the West itself support ISIS's creation? Take a look at these documents written by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency in 2012. This document shows that groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which morphed into ISIS, have always been the major opposition groups in Syria, and that the West actively supported that opposition. Here's what else the DIA says. Quote, if the situation unravels, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime. Now, this goes beyond the blowback theory, the idea that the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq inadvertently laid the groundwork for the rise of radical groups like ISIS. This shows that what the West wanted to do was make way for the possibility of establishing a group like ISIS in order to, quote, isolate the Syrian regime. Now, when we talk about the U.S. launching a war on terror or aiding terrorist groups to destabilize countries, we're not talking about a government acting on behalf of the average U.S. citizen, right? After all, what's you or I gain from the destabilization of a country like Iraq or Syria? We're talking about a government acting on behalf of a small number of people who would benefit from such an event. Stay with me here, because speaking of the war on terror, let's remember where this verbiage originated. September 11th, 2001, Tom Brokaw announces on NBC that there's been a declaration of war by terrorists in the United States. Now, Tom Brokaw had worked with the CIA on news stories in the past, but also significant, especially to our discussion tonight, is the fact that he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which has been called, quote, the nearest thing we have to a ruling establishment in the U.S. CFR members regularly hold meetings with high-ranking U.S. government and intelligence officials, and many CFR members hold high-ranking positions in the government themselves. Allen Dulles, the first head of the CIA, was CFR director for 42 years. But that's not all. CFR members include a majority of all CIA directors, several presidents and vice presidents from both reigning parties, a majority of all secretaries of state, several chairs of the Federal Reserve, and many high-ranking commanders in NATO and the military. Members of Congress with foreign policy responsibilities are often members of the CFR as well. Now, this is important because this means that those people making these high-level decisions about U.S. policy could be influenced by their relationship with this think tank, a think tank that has a reputation for being Wall Street's think tank and influencing foreign policy so that it reflects the interests of the elite. But when the CFR is mentioned in the corporate press, it's usually referred to as a prominent foreign policy think tank, with no mention of its robust ties to pro-war entities like Wall Street or the military-industrial complex. Now, this is in part because many of the nation's top journalists are also CFR members, and executives at many of these U.S. broadcasters and magazines are as well. One such magazine is Newsweek, whose international affairs editor used to work at the European sister organization to the CFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is just as influential in Europe as the CFR is here in the US. Now, you could say, who cares? It shouldn't matter that a man from the CFR now works in the media, unless this pro-war, pro-Western bias is reflected in that publication. So is it? We'll be digging into this story tonight as we speak to a journalist who resigned from Newsweek for this very reason. It's the News with Rick Sanchez, where we do believe it's time to do news again. Here's the list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. Why is the U.S. still freely bombing Iraq and Syria? Are those speaking out against the OPCW facing censorship? And more on censorship, was 2019 the year social media censorship began to really take hold? On Sunday, Washington conducted airstrikes in Iraq and Syria with Boeing F-15 fighter jets. The Pentagon says that the 5 facilities that were attacked are linked to an Iranian-backed militia. Joining us to unpack this is former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michelle.
The first thing I want to get your grasp on is, even though the United States says that this is a justified attack because it's an Iranian-backed militia and this is a designated terror group, in fact, it has been since 2009, is that still illegal under international law for a country to conduct airstrikes without the sovereign nation giving its consent?
I think the short answer is yes, even though American forces are present legally in Iraq with the agreement of the Iraqi government, unlike is the case in Syria, we didn't have permission for these strikes. And remember, this group, Kataib Hezbollah, is part of the popular mobilization forces under Iraqi command. And by the way, they say they did not do this. There actually is a real question mark. Look, as we saw from the lies from Syria about Douma and so forth, the stuff coming out about the OPCW and the falsification of what really happened there, you know, it's amazing how quickly we reach these conclusions and start killing people. If I could back up just a little bit, though.
Please.
The stuff you mentioned about that 2012 memo from DIA. In 2016, when Trump accused Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton of being the founder and co-founder of ISIS, I contacted the Trump campaign because I knew people there and said, look, you've got them dead to rights. You can nail them on this. Here is the memo. Who is the head of DIA at the time that came out? Mike Flynn with the campaign.
Wow.
Go get them. And instead, they came back with, what he really meant was our premature withdrawal from Iraq created a vacuum. That's what he really meant. They did not want to point to this because the CFR, the other groups, the establishment people had already taken over the campaign by that point. So the Borg is there. The Borg is in control of everything. And that's what I think we're really seeing now here in Iraq, is that they're still trying to provoke a conflict with Iran by hitting Iranian allied groups in Syria and in Iraq. And I think we're back to now, what will Trump do? Will Trump take the bait? You know, he didn't take the bait in June when they shot down that drone. And the question is, will they finally get him to take the direct action against Iran that they've been wanting all along?
Now, what I want to do is bring in Dan Kovalik, the author of many books, including No More War and The Plot to Attack Iran. Dan, I want to ask you this. It's been said that the group that the U.S. supposedly attacked with these 5 facilities is actually a group that was aligned against ISIS. So in theory, this is a group that should have been our ally. Here, I guess we get to the essential question that Jim and I were just touching on. Is it that we are so hell-bent on being against Iran that we'll even attack people that are attacking ISIS, or is there a broader agenda at play?
Well, I would say, indeed, we're willing to attack groups that are fighting ISIS. Even the mainstream press at times, I even heard NPR this evening, had a commentator who admitted that the group we attacked in Iraq, and by the way, most of the group are Iraqis, not Iranians, have been fighting ISIS successfully, and in fact have been a key in Iraq to getting rid of ISIS. And again, on and off, you'll hear this acknowledged. And of course, Iran itself, let's remember, helped the United States fight the Taliban in Afghanistan, helped the United States go after al-Qaeda leaders. Iran itself is against al-Qaeda and ISIS. In fact, it's very interesting that the U.S. seems hell-bent on getting rid of every government that is aligned against al-Qaeda and ISIS, which includes Iran, which includes the Assad government in Syria, and which included Muammar Gaddafi's government in Libya, which we dispatched, knowing that it could lead to the spread of jihadism throughout the Middle East, and that's exactly what it did.
Jim, I see you laughing, so I want to bring you in. What's your response?
I couldn't have said it clearer myself. That's exactly right. I mean, look, I heard from one of my sources today that not only is there serious doubt that the Kataib Hezbollah was behind this, it may have been some ISIS-linked group that did this precisely for the reason that would provide the pretext for doing this. I think most Americans have bought the narrative that we're fighting the war on al-Qaeda and ISIS and terror, when in fact we have been allied with these groups really ever since the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, which is where al-Qaeda started in the first place. We used
right, it was the CIA's database of terrorists.
And it was funded by the Saudis, allied with the Pakistani ISI intelligence. And look, we used them in Bosnia, we used them in Kosovo, we used them in Libya, we're using them in Syria. The idea we're fighting these groups rather than using them as kind of like frenemies, nasty little people that can be useful to our ends, and providing the pretext for going after strategic targets, right now specifically the Iranians, but really behind them the Russians, and I would say actually at some point the Chinese as well.
Now, Iraq actually condemned this attack and said that, its sovereignty was violated. How significant is that, given that this is a post-2003 Iraqi government?
It is significant, and of course, again, obviously, this is the government that we installed in the wake of our invasion. But it's not like we can necessarily maintain control of all the groups and factions politically in Iraq today. The question is this a fully sovereign state? Do they have the ability to say to us, "Get out of here"? And if they did that, would we actually leave?
That's a good question, Dan. Finally, I want to ask you: is it true that regardless of what the United States may do, that Iran is only growing in its influence in the region?
Well, I think Iran has a great influence in the region, and we know it was predictable that Iran's influence would increase once the U.S. got rid of Saddam Hussein, who was propping up the Sunni minority in Iraq. We knew that if he was gotten rid of and that the majority took over, meaning the Shia population, they would align with Iran. That's exactly what happened. But the U.S. made that happen. And now the U.S. begrudges Iran for gaining influence that the U.S. gave it because of the invasion of Iraq. It simply doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense from a foreign policy point of view.
Dan Kovalik, Jim Jatras, thank you both.
Thank you.
We turn now to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, an international watchdog organization created to oversee the elimination of chemical weapons. Earlier this year, we learned from multiple whistleblowers at this organization that the impartiality of the OPCW had been compromised, as it hid evidence to suggest the staging of the 2018 chemical attack in Douma, Syria, an attack that paved the way for further military action against the country, including a bombing campaign featuring over 100 of Raytheon's Tomahawk missiles. Now, even when WikiLeaks began releasing OPCW documents backing up these claims of these whistleblowers, most of the corporate-owned media outlets refused to touch these revelations, causing at least one journalist at Newsweek to resign earlier this month. In his resignation letter, he wrote, quote, "It's a shame you will be losing a talented journalist who actually cares about important reporting and who was excited to work here, because you value protecting U.S. interests more. Because of behavior like this, more and more people will continue to turn away from places like Newsweek because you treat audiences like idiots and withhold from them provable facts that they can easily find elsewhere." Joining me now is Tariq Haddad, the UK-based journalist in question. Thanks for coming on, Tariq. If you could first give us a brief timeline of what went down between you and Newsweek's editors in your effort to publish this news about the OPCW whistleblowers.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. So it started roughly in mid-November. I started to cover the Syria, kind of the Turkish invasion into Syria after the US announced that they were withdrawing troops. A week into the attack, Turkey was accused of using white phosphorus, so I reported on this as I normally would. I did a follow-up story about why white phosphorus continues to be used and the kind of chemical weapons conventions around that. So it was when I was doing that story, I started to become aware of other kind of things that were happening at the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I started to hear about whistleblowers and leaks, but it was still, kind of tangential evidence at that time. But more and more evidence was building, and then it got to 25th of November, and then a journalist here in the UK by the name of Peter Hitchens for the Mail on Sunday, he wrote a piece with a leaked letter with one of the OPCW scientists, and this letter is now available via WikiLeaks. I tried to report this, and I approached my editors to say, this is an important story, we should be reporting it, and that was the moment it was declined.
Now, after it was,
I don't know what kind of more contact. Mm-hmm.
Now, after it was declined, did you go back and forth with them a little bit? And what kind of reasons did they give you for not putting this out?
Sure. I think this touches on a very kind of troubling trend in the media at the moment, is that it was my efforts to, or my intelligence or my abilities as a reporter were kind of ignored, and I was, just referred to a Bellingcat article that addressed these leaks. What a lot of people might not know about Bellingcat is that they're funded by places like the Atlantic Council, or they have deep connections with the Atlantic Council and places like the National Endowment for Democracy, essentially think tanks and US State Department funded agencies and things of that nature. So they are essentially a propaganda arm, and now there is clear evidence to say this.
Right.
So I had a problem with that in the first. I had a problem with that because I'm aware of this background. So for me, that's a conflict of interest, and I also, was capable of, going through the evidence by myself. I took apart that Bellingcat article. I refuted the points that were raised, and when I did this, the editors still were not willing to run the story. So it shows this kind of trend in the media at the moment where editors are relying on Bellingcat, even though there is evidence to say that they're not a journalistic enterprise; they are government propaganda.
Right, and for our audience members who may not know, the Atlantic Council takes money from NATO. The National Endowment for Democracy was created to do the CIA's work overtly. Now, I want to turn to the Council on Foreign Relations. We have a man named Dimi Ryder, who's Newsweek's International Affairs editor, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, who you've written about in the recent past. Do you have any firsthand knowledge of the CFR's influence on Newsweek's international affairs reporting?
Sure. Just to be clear with Dimi Ryder, he was at the European Council of Foreign Relations, but it's the sister think tank. So, I mean, he was, he's still listed as I believe a fellow at that organization. And this is, I'm not aware of other individuals, but kind of once I started to investigate this, I realized that this was a trend among many media organizations. And then most famously, there was Fareed Zakaria, who will be very well known to US audiences. He was the editor at Newsweek for 10 years. Prior to Newsweek, he was the editor of Foreign Affairs, which is the Council on Foreign Relations' own publication. Throughout the Iraq War, he was one of the biggest cheerleaders. As early as 2001, he was writing articles, saying why the US should go to war with Iraq. Numerous articles of that nature. Interestingly, Foreign Affairs, that publication at the time of the Iraq War, just to show you how influential the Council of Foreign Relations is, it won, it was ranked the first place in this survey of, how it influences public opinion and how it influences politicians. So we clearly have this organization that's pushing essentially fake narratives out, and it has a deeply, deep effect on the public opinion.
In the final 30 seconds here, I want to ask you that given you've been questioning some of these official narratives, specifically here with the OPCW scandal, have you experienced any censorship on the major social media platforms?
Yeah, I have actually, funnily enough. And there's evidence of this widespread, not just to me. It seems that Twitter itself is kind of shadow banning certain accounts or certain tweets that are mentioning that OPCW are getting hidden from people's timelines. It's kind of since I've resigned, I have decided to become an independent journalist. I tweeted a few messages just to thank everyone that supported me, listed my Patreon page that's just gone live. And then as soon as this was done, I received numerous tweets that say that these were hidden. So there is definitely censorship going on.
Tariq Haddad, thank you so much for your work and thanks for coming on. In fact, censorship on social media has been a theme here on this newscast, and it certainly looks like it'll be trending throughout 2020. RT's Ilya Petrenko gives us a year in review of social media censorship in 2019.
I'll tell you what, having this job for 6 years has made me report on censorship quite a few times. Look at this freshman Giorno Petrenko asking about Facebook censorship at a press briefing. Hey, young man, you have no idea what awaits you in 2019. By the end of the decade, look at it. The evolution of online platforms has gone all the way towards zero tolerance for offenders, even though it all once started down there with pretty much zero regulation. But who decides what exactly makes someone an offender? All right, let's dig into the 2019 stage of the evolution, look at these one by one, and check out their censorship record. YouTube worked hard on ridding their platform of harassment. See, the latest update to their harassment policy came out in December. Go on, read into it. You'll find words like veiled threats, implied threats. Right. They're warning that whatever that's supposed to mean will be punished. And you'll find zero examples and no proper details.
YouTube has always enforced these policies seemingly at random or not at all, so why should I trust them to do it now? I'm skeptical.
Why are the late-night hosts allowed to roast people on YouTube, pick on people's physical appearance, but other YouTubers can't?
So YouTube has put out its new guidelines. They don't set lines, and they don't guide.
Yep, the latest in a series of policy updates. After the previous ones, YouTube didn't hesitate to take action. The result, record-breaking numbers of accounts and videos taken down. In 2019, Facebook really took us all by surprise by showing what it takes to put on a new face. Not that it looked like they were keen to do it, but someone just happened to notice that while trying to dodge a defamation lawsuit, Facebook referred to itself as a publisher. Look at this mature CEO telling Congress his network is a tech company, not a media one. Well, that happened before 2019. In the new era, FB gave itself the green light to censor just about anything, which they've been up to quite strenuously. Although, in March, when the New Zealand shooter live-streamed a massacre of 50 people, everyone was like, where the hell were the moderators or censors or anyone to stop this? Another thing, I won't call anyone out for inconsistency, but in a recent interview, Mr. Zuckerberg said no to censoring political ads, even if they contain lies.
What I believe is that in a democracy, it's really important that people can see for themselves what politicians are saying so that they can make their own judgments. And, I don't think that a private company should be censoring politicians or news.
Tech giants, however, have been blamed for screwing up a bit of campaigning, like when Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, challenged Google for taking down her ads.
This alarming trend has been growing, with tech giants continuing to silence voices and restrict access to information. This concentration of power and influence is a direct threat to our democracy.
By the way, did you know about this side to it? 2019 saw the list of Facebook moderators claiming to have PTSD growing, with a former employee suing the social media giant, even though the company said it was offering all the required support. Well, no point in digging too deep if the story's repeating itself. Twitter's mastered the art of new era suspensions and bans too. The vagueness of the rules probably isn't so much to worry about. So you can get in trouble for, it can be many things, from supporting Julian Assange to pulling a prank on the fans of the Cats movie. But just keep in mind what kind of folks you may find among Twitter's staff. A British Army PSYOPs soldier, or Saudi Arabia's spies tasked with digging into the accounts of the kingdom's critics. Well, we'll keep using all of them anyway, right? Let's wish the industry pioneers well in wherever the evolution takes them in the new year.
Yellowstone National Park has seen more geyser eruptions this year than in the past 5 years combined. In fact, from 2015 to 2017, the geysers didn't erupt at all. Why? RT correspondent Natasha Sweet has more on what scientists are disagreeing on.
One Yellowstone National Park geyser alone saw more than 45 eruptions in 2019 and at least 32 in 2018. With a supervolcano steaming magma beneath its park, many wonder if there's something bigger in the making. There's no question the geysers in Yellowstone have been active for the past 2 years, giving tourists something to remember. The Steamboat Geyser specifically has been especially active, with 45 eruptions this year and 32 in 2018. But in 2015, 2016, and 2017, there was no reported activity for the park's geysers. Scientists are scratching their heads, all the while many are disagreeing on whether or not the park's supervolcanoes are due for an eruption. A scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey confirms it is an active volcano and it will erupt again. But the question of when is full of conflicting theories. Supervolcanoes are rare and are capable of spewing out massive explosions. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, supervolcanoes consist of eruptions releasing more than 240 cubic miles of material. That adds up to almost twice the volume of Lake Erie. Yellowstone is one of the world's most well-known places to possess volcanoes that have produced a volcanic explosivity index of 8. And just to give you an idea of how often that occurs, scientists have only identified 42 eruptions in the last 36 million years that ranked a VEI of 8. Scientists have identified 3 massive eruptions in Yellowstone's history. There were 2 VEI 8 eruptions, one roughly 2 million years ago and another 640,000 years ago. A VEI 7 eruption also occurred 1.3 million years ago. While scientists haven't found an answer as to why Yellowstone's geysers are more active this year, they also don't know when the park's supervolcanoes will erupt again. But there is a consensus that it won't happen anytime soon. In Los Angeles, Natasha Sweet, RT.
That's our news. We'll see you right here tomorrow.